I'd like to start by sharing this picture, a well-known picture of the day that Golden Dawn's leadership and functionaries were convicted by a court in Athens. And I'd like to start with this picture because I think much of the literature on the far right does not really address what's going on here. This massive mobilization, probably one of the biggest anti-fascist mobilizations in Greece, one of the sizable ones in Europe, and during a pandemic. Now, I think that the literature on far-right parties tends to ignore how societies deal with extremism, with a few exceptions. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book, and I've been subsequently been trying to do, is to highlight societal responses to extremism. Now, the literature on the rise of the far right, of course, it's a pretty voluminous, a sizable literature, but primarily treats the far right as a discursive phenomenon, I would say. So some of us who study this phenomenon tend to assess the supply of ideas, programs, and rhetoric. As such, we tend to treat it as an electoral phenomenon and try to also examine how voters, why voters turn to these parties, whether it is for economic, cultural, or institutional grievances. Also, the literature tends to focus on the far right as primarily a national or a whole nation phenomenon, to use Rocken's discussion of biases in comparative politics. And there's only scant attention to subnational patterns. And again, there are some exceptions, and of course, Vasiliki and Labrini and Roumanias have been part of this exception, looking at subnational patterns. Now, I think the literature has served us well in understanding some of the most important radical right-wing parties, but it is less satisfactory, I think, when it comes to understanding more extreme parties, some of the parties that I have here, extremist right-wing parties, Forza Nuova, Casa Pound Italia, Jobbik, Kotleba's party, or Slovakia, and the NPD. So I think what I'm trying to do in this book, and I also suggest here, is to try to understand the far right, not only as a discursive, but also as an organizational phenomenon. I think it is important to understand these parties as organizational phenomena, especially when it comes to these really extremist parties, the neo-Nazi or the neo-fascist parties, because both for ideological, but also for pragmatic reasons, these parties try to grow roots in local societies. They do try to set up subnational organizational units. They try to recruit new members and mobilize street-level support. So in this sense, they radically try to change their environment, but also in this sense, it's important to understand how they interact with their environments. Extremist right-wing parties, once viewed as organizations, it is noticeable that they're hybrid organizations. On the one hand, they try to mobilize at the street level, and on the other hand, they try to play within the domain of institutional politics. I think I agree with Kitchell and Telaborta that I would call these parties movement parties. So they're contesting politics, again, both through conventional and contentious means. Part of what they're trying to do is to grow roots in local societies and to mobilize local support. Of course, like I said, there are a number of such parties in Europe, and the Golden Dawn, much of what it tried to do was this street level mobilization. And it's interesting that some of this mobilization using some of the same symbols like Molon Lave, the Spartan images, we also found recently in the US. So I think this right-wing mobilization we also saw in a different, of course, context and in a different manner in the US. Now, when it comes to these really extreme parties, exactly because of this propensity to engage in contentious politics, they tend to attract or they tend to grow roots in local society, tends to generate institutional and societal responses against them. So by institutional responses, I mean legislative measures, judicial processes, largely what Kapocha in his work on Interwar Europe and in his subsequent work deals with under the category of militant democracy. So these types of parties tend to generate militant democratic responses, and these responses are largely at the institutional level. At the same time, though, and I think this is an under emphasized part in the literature, including the one I mentioned, they also generate societal responses. And that's where anti-fascist mobilization comes in. There has been some work on British anti-fascism, and more recently, of course, it's a very salient topic in the US, so there has been some work on the American anti-fascist movement. And what I'm trying to do here is to look at anti-fascism in Greece and try to trace both its development, but also try to assess its possible effects. So when it comes to anti-fascist mobilization in Greece, I'll be very brief here, and there's more about this in the book. In the 90s and in the 2000s, it was largely radical and revolutionary leftist groups and factions that were involved in anti-fascism, as well as anarchist groups. This was a time of the anti-globalization, especially in the early 2000s, the anti-globalization movement. And part of that movement also got involved in anti-racist activity and anti-racist mobilization. In the 2010s, we get more robust anti-fascist response and a wider one. So we get KRFA, which is the front wing of Andarsia, a political party that doesn't get as much electoral support, but it's quite active on the streets. We also get a number of pro-immigrant groups, human rights groups, unions, and interestingly, hundreds and hundreds of small anarchist groups that get involved in anti-fascism. In terms of their resources, of course, they bring all this experience from anti-fascist mobilization in the 90s and subsequently in the 2000s. And they also bring communicative resources. There's considerable press coverage of anti-fascist activities, and there's considerable effort through the press to mobilize anti-fascist groups. There's also Indymedia. Indymedia is a major resource for communicative resource for anti-fascist groups. In terms of informational resources, one of the things that happened after the rise of the Golden Dawn, the electoral rise of the Golden Dawn is, and of course the violence that spread throughout Greece, was the monitoring of racist violence and the recording of racist violence incidents that was undertaken by a number of NGOs. Also, Jail Golden Dawn, which is this network of anti-fascist lawyers that started following the development, the organizational development, and subsequently the judicial process against the Golden Dawn, and Golden Dawn Watch, which followed what went on in court. There's intellectual resources. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but I think this litigation efforts by this self-declared anti-fascist lawyers was quite important, and I'll explain in a while why. There, of course, these anti-fascist groups have links to political parties. I mentioned one party, but also there are links to other parties, especially, of course, of the radical left. And I think one component that I find important is this spatial resources that anti-fascists utilized, when they occupy different buildings, especially close to universities. I think these are resources that can be used against fascist or right-wing extremist mobilization, especially when it comes to more violent forms of anti-fascist activity. Now, their tactics, to a large extent, they are involved in institutional politics, exercise pressure on MPs to ban the party. This was the case in the 2000s. There have been a couple of queries in parliament against the Golden Dawn and asking if it should be banned. But also, I think the civil action suit against the Golden Dawn is probably one of the most interesting institutional tactics. So these anti-fascist lawyers who questioned and mistrusted state authority and mistrusted the state prosecution, they managed to get access to the trial and to defend in some incidents both the Fistos family and others. And basically, that their presence was important, as I will show in the outcome. There's also social mobilization. They have been pretty successful, I think, the anti-fascist movement in trying to get as many people out on the street as possible. And I think what we saw on the 7th of October in 2020 is part of that. It's the culmination of, I think, longer efforts to mobilize people and get as many people out as possible to demonstrate against the Golden Dawn. Part of this action is militant. Is disruptive. So they try to disrupt activities organized by the Golden Dawn, either in its branches or outside in the street. By disrupting, I mean trying to, through counter demonstrations, to frustrate the organizational efforts of the Golden Dawn. And part of it is militant. Part of it is violent. So there have been attacks against buildings and against people throughout this period. I'll come back to that in a minute. What I try to do for the purposes of this book and what I'm trying to do with Jason Labrianou at the University of Cyprus, we're trying to find some evidence to track or trace anti-fascist mobilization in Greece. So what I did for the book was to code all anti-fascist activities published in Indomedia for a period of almost 10 years. As you can see here, much of this activity involves protests and demonstration. That's more than 50% of nearly 3,000 activities that were organized in Greece throughout this period by anti-fascist groups and were published on Indomedia. In terms of anti-fascism across space, it's largely an urban phenomenon. So we rarely see this phenomenon in small localities. Many of these activities are, of course, in Athens and in suburbs, Vasiliki, Piraeus. And it's also in some other settings where there are universities, although that's more of a hypothesis than a hard fact. There's a strong correlation that I have reported, both in the book and it keeps coming up between, of course, what the Golden Dawn does and what anti-fascist groups do. The correlation is between 0.7 and 0.5 to 0.7, depending on what kind of correlation one uses. And this is, of course, when it comes to anti-fascism, like I said, the size of the population of a local community is important. So this is a measure of the number of anti-fascist activities per 1,000 inhabitants. So the greener, the more the anti-fascist activities. So the greener part is from 1.3 to 2 activities per 1,000 population. As you can see, of course, Athens, well, you cannot say it's too small. Athens is, of course, a hub for anti-fascist activity. That's even when taking its population into account. But also there are some other areas, and you can see here Rethymno, Iraklio, Kavala, I think that's Xanthi and Agrini are also and Volos are also interesting hubs of anti-fascist activity based on population. This is on using also more recent data that Jason and I have been working on. Now, what I try to do is to trace anti-fascist mobilization across time and to compare it with right-wing extremist mobilization. So what I did is try to count the number of events organized by the Golden Dawn and reported in its newspaper from 2007 to 2016. These are all local organizational activities reported in the Golden Dawn Chryssi Aυγή newspaper across time. So that's about 960, hundreds of issues of the newspaper. And on the other hand, try to see the same equivalent activities for anti-fascist actors in Indomedia. So this is a merge of two very different data sets. And when this merge happens, you can see that there is a strong pattern here. There's a correlation between what the right-wing extremists do and what the anti-fascists do. The one difference is that, of course, on the y-axis, on the left-hand side, you can see local Golden Dawn activism. So that's in the tens or dozens, and the y-axis on the right is in the hundreds. So that's 3 or 4 or 5 times more anti-fascist activities than Golden Dawn activities throughout this period. And the pattern is similar. So after 2011, there's a spike. So there's this wave that we talk about and we hear about in social movement literature. And then, of course, after the litigation, after the criminal prosecution of the Golden Dawn's leadership, it tends to subside. Now, I talked a little bit before about violence. Violence is present in about 1 out of 10 anti-fascist activities. So even though the anti-fascist movement is often portrayed as violence-prone, I think it's there, but it's a very small part of the entire anti-fascist spectrum. And based on this Indymedia analysis, there is also similar patterns of Golden Dawn violence and anti-fascist violence. Now, the critical question, I guess, and I'm getting close to the end here, is whether anti-fascism matters. So what I tried to do for the purposes of the book, and I hope to be able to continue, is of course talk to anti-fascist actors, and they're absolutely convinced. So through these in-depth interviews, they're absolutely convinced that their mobilization matters. Of course, that's a critical issue in the literature on social movements, whether they have a net effect on outcomes. And based on this qualitative evidence that I would present now, I think they do. So anti-fascist mobilization, there's pretty strong evidence that I present in the book that it hindered the organizational expansion or presence of the Golden Dawn. In the book, I have these micro case studies of Ioannina, Patra, and a few other cases where the anti-fascist mobilization really frustrated the organizational efforts of the Golden Dawn. It's more effective when it's non-violent. So even though some anti-fascist activists think that violence is necessary, there's no evidence to support that. Actually, when there's more institutional or contentious activity that is not violent, it helps bring together larger groups of people, helps bring together local majorities, and build alliances with other actors. Violence tends to scare away more moderate actors when it comes to anti-fascist mobilization. Also, it's interesting that I think the anti-fascist actors that were, I think, most effective were the ones that were involved not only in contentious or militant activity, but also were eager to use the institutional mechanisms to deal with the Golden Dawn. So its most notable effect, I would argue, was on changing the way institutional actors dealt with the Golden Dawn, whether this was the police and a restructuring of the police to deal with racist violence, or in this case, the courts. Basically, anti-fascist mobilization, especially in that critical moment in 2012, but also 2013, after the Fissos murder, was critical, I think, in changing the way the Greek state dealt with right-wing extremism. It was not the first time that there was violence from the Golden Dawn. There was there was criminal violence earlier, as we know, and key people in the party were charged and imprisoned for that, but not dealt. The Greek state did not deal with this issue in the same way as it did after 2013. And I think the evidence I presented here, so this is part of the evidence. You can see that this anti-fascist mobilization started well before the Fissos murder, and I think it was important in changing the way the Greek state dealt with this issue. More importantly, I would think, is the actual judicial process, because during the court case, the state prosecutor, so the representative of the Greek state, basically made a proposal to acquit all major leaders and functionaries of the Golden Dawn of the accusations they were facing. And what really won the day in terms of the verdict was this anti-fascist litigation. So the anti-fascists were able to convince the court that what the Golden Dawn, these incidents of violence from the Golden Dawn were tied together. They showed a pattern, and this was a pattern of criminal, of coming from a criminal organization. So I think the outcome, although it's easy to say that yes, it was of course liberal institutions at work. So the Golden Dawn lost its elections in 2019, and then lost the court case in 2020. So the liberal institutions, the pillars of liberal democracy were at work, and that's how things worked in Greece. And Golden Dawn got defeated. I think there's a bigger story there, and I think that's how that relates to how Greek society dealt with right-wing extremism and how it managed to mobilize against it. So in terms of the broader idea of reacting to extremism, I think it's important when it comes to parties like this to move from the discursive to the organizational level. I think this shift to the organizational level allows us to go from the national to the local level. 60 or so many years ago, Duverger talked about the life of local party branches and encouraged scholars to look into that. I don't think that has happened that much, but I think by looking at right-wing extremism at the organizational, at the mobilizational level, we can move from the national to the local, and we can bring in not just institutional, but also societal actors, and basically bring the question of right-wing extremism to every single one of us. Extremism, and that's as much of a hypothesis as it is a conclusion, seems that it's more likely to thrive where local societies sit on the fence, waiting for elections and institutions to effectively address it. So I think society matters. I think I'll end here.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Antonis, for this great talk and for summing up all of this complicated facts into kind of a straightforward presentation. I won't waste any of our time. I'll move on immediately to Vasiliki. The floor is yours. Do let me know when you're done so I can open it to the rest of the audience. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Rini. Thank you for your invitation. And thank you, Antonis, for this intellectual exchange. I will start with my comments. Your talk, Antonis' talk, was very interesting. And Antonis, in his talk, touched upon two debates. First, the rise of the far right, and second, how to confront and to deal with the rising far right extremism. Although both discussions are closely connected to each other, the question of how far-right extremism should be handled in liberal democracies was for a long time ignored, to the exception of Islamic fundamentalism and religious-based terrorism. Until recently, I think violent extremism was perceived as a rather marginal phenomenon in the post-war Western societies, and extremist parties or movements have been treated as pariahs. However, illiberal and authoritarian trends are apparent both in fragile as well as in established democracies, marking a struggle between liberal democracy and its opponents. There are several opponents to liberal democracy. Antonis focused on the far-right extremism in Greece and discussed the institutional and societal responses against it. His analytical perspective on far-right extremism is organizational. Generally speaking, there is a question about whether or not parties or movements, organizations still matter As we know, much of the party literature highlights the lack of incentives to invest in party organization, which to a large extent is replaced by party leaders, by experts, by the mass media, of course. With regard to social mobilizations, new forms of activism, such as the movements of the square, are very flexible, horizontal, decentralized, without an organizational buildup. However, according to today's presentation of Antonis Ellinas and other findings from our own research, actually, with Lamprini and other colleagues, Dinas and Konstantinidis, local organizational units offer extremists the capability to communicate, to collaborate, and to convince. Kashmude emphasized the local dimension for both the rise and the survival of the far right. For the far right extremists, the local level is a prominent arena where they first act. It is also the place where they are directly confronted with organized societal reactions from anti-fascist mobilizations and actors. This means, in other words, that local organization still matters. Mapping carefully, as Antonis did, the anti-fascist events organized in Greece between 2007 and 2016, which is, Antonis, an impressive effort in itself. Antonis found a strong correlation between the overall Golden Dawn and anti-fascist activities, which happened at that time, as well as between their violent actions and reactions. Anti-fascist reactions seem to be effective in combating far-right extremism. Civil society as a whole plays a role in preventing and countering violent extremism and radicalization by reducing the appeal of extremism, by raising awareness on its threat through information campaign, dialogue, etc., etc. Anti-fascism is part of civil society, and as it is said in today's presentation of Antonis, its actions are more effective when they are not violent. The fact, however, that it does use violence, that violence is not excluded by default, raises the question of how it affects extremism as an overall phenomenon. Are there reinforcing effects? Does exposure to violence increase aggression between far-right and far-left violent activists? How do local communities with far-right extremism react to this interactive extremism? I borrow this term or this idea from Barry Richards, the idea of interaction of extremisms. Lastly, one more about the discussion on how to effectively fight extremism, institutional measures or actions from the society, from below. Actually, this is not a dilemma. In the literature, several models discuss about what can be done to defend liberal democracy. There are legal instruments, preventing measures, cooperation of governments with NGOs, national strategies, action plans, etc. All and even more are sine qua non for tackling far-right extremism, taking account, as Antonis did, of the case of Golden Dawn, both institutional measures and legal measures. The criminal law were used to contain it. Civil society, the same as the EU, applied pressure on the power system in Greece, on the government to bring Golden Dawn to justice. I would say this is a puzzle that needs different actors, techniques, and strategies to be resolved. Thank you for this opportunity to comment Antonis' talk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vasiliki. I think I'll give the floor a little bit to Adonis to respond to the comments and one or two questions that Vasiliki posed. And in the meantime, please do pose your questions in the Q&A so we can get the discussion rolling while Adonis responds. Adonis, have you written down? Do you know what you want? Do you remember what Vasiliki asked? Okay, great. So the floor is yours, and then we'll open it up. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Vasiliki, for your comments. Thank you so much for this wonderful collaboration over the years. Is it institutions or society? I think what I try to suggest is that society or social actors can have a big impact if they have this multifaceted strategy in which they work both mobilizing on the street, and that's part of what societal actors do and what they can do, but also try to work within the institutional arena. And I think what the anti-fascist movement did in the past few years was exactly that. So they tried to work within the institutions, not just outside the institutions. And that's why I think they were effective, because they were mobilizing people on the street at the same time when they're working their case in courts. So I think societies can change the way institutional actors behave if they try to work within the system, not just outside the system. And I think that responds to the very good point you raised about violence. Yeah, because yes, there is definitely an interactive component to violence. There's this tango of violent activity on the two sides. But like I said, it's easy to, I think, dismiss anti-fascist activity as being violent. And I think what I try to show is that, yes, there is some violence, but the vast majority of anti-fascist activism is not violent. Part of it is institutional, part of it is non-conventional, part of it is militant, but not violent. So this idea that Antifa is a violent group, that all they do is act violently, I think is a misrepresentation of what actually happened in Greece. Now, why invest in organizations? I think parties like this have to invest in organizations for both pragmatic reasons, because their challenge to the environment is to their environments is so big. They want to radically transform their environments, so they have to invest in organizational assets to do that. This is the kind of challenge they present to the environment, so they have to invest in order to face the uncertainty that the environment will generate for them. So that's one aspect, but also ideologically, this is how they operate. So fascism, of course, has this violent and organizational component that is part of why these parties invest in local organizations. And it's different, I think you're right, from what other radical right-wing parties might choose to do, and what much of the literature assumes that parties do, especially in a new technological era where you don't have to have such major organizational infrastructure to achieve electoral results. So I think I'll leave it at that, and then we can continue.